Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Well, hello. Thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, Head of Marketing at InfoTools. Today, we're joined by David Paull, founder of Dialsmith. Dialsmith is a technology and consulting company, pioneers in instant and continuous moment-to-moment feedback. Whether for in-person or online focus groups, IDIs, surveys, or corporate meetings and events, Dialsmith has tools and expertise to help learn what people really think, making critical business decisions, keeping visitors engaged, and to give your audience the best possible experience. David is also on the TEDx Portland leadership team, so sit back and enjoy what should be a really interesting episode. No pressure, David, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
You're welcome. So, David, what's the most significant thing you're going to share with us today?
I think the best thing we can talk about today is around messaging and how effective messaging follows a storytelling framework that anyone can deploy.
Cool. Looking forward to diving into this. So before we do, though, what pieces of the puzzle are essential from an effective messaging perspective?
Well, when we engage in messaging projects, we really work on four main things with our clients. We make sure that they deeply understand the persona of their ideal customer, whether you call it persona or avatar or whatever you've learned in your background, but really not overlooking that step of making sure that you deeply understand, not just at a superficial level, but really at the deepest possible level, an emotional level, what's important and critical to your target customers as it relates to what it is that you're offering. Secondly, then, is understanding all of the behavioral psychology and cognitive biases that come into play when people process information and make decisions, and either learning how to short circuit those if you want to try to get around them, or sometimes you can really lean into them and use them to your advantage. But you have to really understand the irrational ways in which people make decisions. And whether you like it or not, that's the reality that has to be dealt with. We then move into a storytelling framework for our messaging, which is one that we developed in-house. We call it the Respect Messaging Framework, RSPCT. I imagine we'll get into those in a bit of detail later, so I'll leave it at that for now. But that's how we go about crafting the messages that we offer. And then we have a very rigorous message testing, refinement, retesting process, so that we don't base anything on assumptions of what we think is right or even what our clients think is right. It's all about what the market thinks. So testing with them is what's critical to wrap things up.
Cool. Okay, so it sounds like we've got a good little plan to discuss today. So the first point you mentioned was personas. Now, we've all had our fair share of these over the years, whether avatars, archetypes, bespoke creations. In your view, what's generally best practice when it comes to personas?
So the best practice for us, and this isn't something that I've created, so I'm sure many people follow these best practices as well, but I think it's worth mentioning because very often I do find that many of these can also be missed, and it's really important that they're not, is really getting into the heart and mind of that potential customer, not just looking at the superficial part of their day and what is it related to what we sell that's important to them and why do they need it, but really peeling back those layers of the onion to get to the core underlying things that really affect them on a day-to-day basis, and what kinds of things can give them anxiety or can shake their confidence or could potentially embarrass them in front of their boss or in front of colleagues. Those are the kinds of emotional triggers that are going to help us drive sales much more than trying to compete on a very superficial level that everyone will be competing on, where, this feature will do this and therefore this will happen. So you, Mr. or Mrs. Persona, will be happy. And that's just way too superficial. So what's really critical and what people often do miss is how deep you really do need to go on those personas. And part of that comes internally from how well you understand your type of customer. And then part of it really benefits from doing research. And often research companies are the worst at taking our own medicine and doing research. So whether it's a research company listening to this, doing it for themselves, or an end client or a brand, what you think you know is often incorrect. And undergoing your own research exercises to make sure that you can really define that persona effectively, I think, is critically important.
Yeah, cool. Are there any no-goes when it comes to personas, things that marketers or product managers should just forget about completely?
I think it goes back to what I said. I think the biggest no-go, I think one of the biggest no-goes is assuming that you know your customer. I think you should simply assume you don't. That's a much safer thing to do. Worst case, you do a deeper dive and you realize you knew more after all. Well, that's great. I think that'll be a rare circumstance, and that would be a good problem to have. Much safer to assume you don't know what you think you know about your customer. And if you ask the right questions, as anyone listening to this knows, you will uncover things that you don't know. And that will be the competitive advantage for you that you will have over others in the market. So I think the no-go is not being too egotistical about it or casual about it, or assuming that we know our customers, we've been doing this for a really long time. That could be just the very reason why you, in fact, don't know them as well as you think you do.
Very cool. Some great points there. So the second aspect you mentioned was cognitive biases, from both those telling and hearing the stories as well, or the messaging. How can brands navigate through those tricky waters of cognitive bias?
Yeah, it really is very tricky. And you're right. It's not only in the telling of the stories, but also in the heuristics that people use in order to make decisions. And those are done on a non-conscious basis. People aren't thinking about it. What's really important is to understand the most common cognitive biases. And this is a topic that over the last maybe 10, 12 years has really become more and more prominent. So this is certainly not the first time people will be hearing about this in our world, but there are dozens and dozens, maybe more than 100 known documented cognitive biases, but there's definitely a long tail. It's an 80-20 where, there's probably 10 to 15 that are most common, and all the rest of them start to get pretty obscure. And if you can become well-versed in the more common ones, which are, of course, like framing effect and self-reference effect and confirmation bias and things like that, you can then use those as you're crafting messages and crafting stories to use those in order to tap into the way people think and make decisions. So a very extreme example that I always like to give is we recreated a known experiment from a university where they tested different food items with research participants based on how good or bad that food item is if you're watching what you eat, let's say for weight loss or for overall health. And half of the participants were shown the food item relative to the number of calories it had, and the other half were shown the food item relative to the amount of physical activity or exercise you'd have to do to work it off. And the most extreme example is one M&M, which has, I think, 16 calories, if I'm remembering correctly. And when shown to those participants, of course, most people thought, yeah, one M&M, 16 calories, no big deal. And the other half of participants were told that one M&M requires walking the length of a football field in order to work it off.
Wow.
And of course, the difference was tremendous when people think, well, I'm going to think twice before I pop this M&M if that's what it takes to work it off. And of course, framing effect is one of the most basic and easy to understand of cognitive biases, but it fits within that world where if you can master even just a few of the most common ones, and when you're crafting your messaging for your target audience, you can take those into account, then you can write and craft those in mind. And like I said earlier, you can either short circuit them by crafting something that will help you get around it, or you might use it to your advantage and really lean into it.
Can you just share with us a bit deeper on leaning into cognitive bias? Like, how would that look like?
Yeah, so let's see. I do actually have an example here. I want to get it right. So there's a cognitive bias that's called the identifiable victim effect. Okay. And what that states is that people can more deeply relate to an individual person in need than a group of people in need. So the example that I've used before is, let's imagine that you work for a nonprofit who's raising money for children in need around the world. Instead of saying something like millions of children face hunger due to food shortages, ... You can instead focus that on one particular child. So this girl, Rokia, and her family struggle for food, education, and medical care, ... And that's, if you've watched any of the late night commercials, at least in the US, where, they want to get you to donate money for things like, I think, Children's International, others like that. They really know how to tap into the fact that if you can focus on one child, or with some other charities, it's one single animal that you can help save, people can much better relate. Even though we know the money isn't going from me to this one person, mentally I can make that connection. So that's a way to lean into it and say, well, we know that people are going to feel that way, so let's craft it in that way to take advantage of the fact that they're going to feel that. Let's not try to get them to not feel it. Let's acknowledge that they will, and then let's lean into that.
Well, it might be showing my age a little bit, but A Little Girl Weeps. Was it back in the 90s, I think?
Exactly.
Was it World Vision, maybe? I can't remember what exactly, but yeah, they were obviously onto it there. And I guess with that scenario, you feel that you can make an impact on that one person, but when it's a million people, it's like, well, what can I do? How can I make a difference? So
yeah, and it's the same thing talking about like plastic pollution in the ocean and how damaging it can be to life in the ocean. That's very different than seeing a photo of a seal with a six-pack ring around its neck, right? That one seal you can relate to. It makes you really sad. Maybe I can prevent that from happening. Whereas the entire ocean that covers 70% of the earth, what could I possibly do?
True. Okay, so number 3, respect storytelling framework. Can you dive into what this is and how it fits into effective messaging?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's based on the initials RSPCT. So what we do when we're crafting messages and stories for clients is we start by uncovering what is the real problem that the client has. And that's why persona work is so important, because it's not the superficial problem that people will off the cuff tell you that they have. It's as you peel away the layers, what is the real root problem? When you can't ask why or tell me more about that anymore, and you finally hit the bottom of that well, that's the real problem that we have to solve for, not the superficial one, like, oh, I need a CRM system so that our salespeople can track their prospects better. Okay, that's not your real problem, right? That's the easy thing on the surface to talk about. Now let's start digging. So first, it's uncovering the real problem. Secondly, is very important. It's uncovering what's at stake. What are the stakes if that real problem doesn't get solved? Because if there are no stakes, there's no problem. If nothing could go terribly wrong and cause you a lot of problems, a lot of pain, a lot of hassle, then you don't really have that problem, and you're not going to be willing to spend time, money, and effort to fix it. So it's understanding what's really at stake if those real problems don't get solved. And then P is what's the perfect outcome. If you could wave a magic wand and you could avoid those stakes and solve that real problem, what would perfect look like to you, Mr. or Mrs. Customer? Then C is the call to action. And this is really where the messaging itself gets crafted. It's crafting story and narrative based messaging, because that speaks much more to the heart than the head. And we're trying to pull emotional levers, which much more effectively drive decision making than than mental triggers. And we're using what we've learned through the real problem, what's at stake, and the perfect outcome in order to craft that story and call to action. And then finally is T, which are testimonials. Seth Godin in his book Tribes famously said, people like us do things like this. Nobody wants to be out there on their own, and people feel incredibly more comfortable and confident to make a decision if they know that once they make that decision, they will be in the company of others like them. So whether it's through testimonials or case studies, I've also found through my own research that they're much more effective if they can be backed by data and statistics. People really don't want to hear glowing reviews and what they would call fluff when I interview people. Those very often get nixed in favor of ones that talk about, X% better, or 30% or 80% of people XYZ, to the point where we won't even use testimonials anymore unless they can be backed by some kind of data. So that's kind of an update to the framework that we've recently made. And so that's the arc of the respect framework.
Yeah, cool. So wrapping up the 4 parts of effective messaging was the testing and refinement. Can you shed some light on how this typically plays out with your engagements?
Yeah, so we'll craft usually at least 2 versions of messaging through the respect framework, so that we can do at minimum an A/B test of 2 different versions. And then what we'll do is we'll go into a message testing phase. And we happen to do it with our own tools. We do it with dial testing because for us, that's the way we can uncover what research participants think of a message at every moment, so that we can go back and analyze every word, every phrase, and use aided recall to take them back. We find that if we let someone, let's say, listen to a message that we've recorded and it's 3 minutes long, and then we ask them, what did you think about that? Tell me about that. You get limited response. People can also, memory is fiction, right? It's some kind of a compiling of what happened in the past. So what we're able to do, when we use our own tools, is we can go back to a particular moment and talk about a participant, about why did you react the way you reacted when the speaker said this. And then we can snap the participant back to that moment. They give us much deeper and richer feedback. And we do that all through the message. Then we'll go and we'll take usually the A and the B version and all of the testing, feedback, and data. And then we'll work on a new version of one message that we feel is much more closer to the mark. But we still don't stop there. We always do one more round of testing because we know we can refine it at least another few percent if we're lucky, maybe more if we didn't do our job as well the first time. And then we get to that final version 3 of the message that's usually the one that goes to market.
Yeah, cool. In terms of what numbers are you normally looking for in terms of your testing, etc.? Do you have a blanket rule or an ideal?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to do it more qualitatively, mainly because We find that if we try to do it with a larger quantitative sample, we always find ourselves with more questions at the end that we're unable to get answers to. So we're not looking for anything scientific about it. We're really looking for that kind of human psychology reaction to the messaging. So we'll usually do it with, anything from maybe 8 to 12 people, a relatively small scale qualitative exercise. And we usually know, even once we get past 4 or 5 interviews, we know how it's going to turn out. And if we up that to 12, we're likely going to see what we would have seen back at 6. So it really depends on the market and how specialized it is or how broad it is to make sure that we're confident. But we're using pretty small samples, and we're doing everything either 1-to-1 or sometimes in small focus groups, but we really prefer IDIs 1-to-1 for this work.
Very cool. Okay. Excuse me. What does good look like when brands get their messaging on point? What outcomes can clients expect to achieve?
I mean, what good really looks like is you want your audience, either consciously or non-consciously, to feel like that brand, they really get me. They know what I'm all about. And that's what we're talking about when we get down to kind of the root, the real deep emotional reactions to things. Anyone can meet your needs on the surface, but when the messaging is just right and it threads that needle, that's when people feel like, oh, like it's like they're reading my mind. They really get me. They know what I'm going through. That's the ultimate outcome that you're going for.
True. And I guess that is even easier to achieve when you go deeper into those personas, like you're saying at the start as well.
Yeah. And I hesitate in conversations like this because like I said earlier, I know what I'm saying is not something that I've invented or created, right? And people could be listening and saying, well, of course that's what you have to do. And I say, yes, except so often it's not done. So what I'm here to advocate for is not, you have to listen to me because I'm so smart, I've created something so great. I'm just here to say we can't ignore these fundamentals that we know work. But yet, when you're in another 80-20 situation and only 20% really go that deep and really do it that well, if you want to compete, that's where you can look for some white space. Where can I go deeper and zig where others are zagging to find that little niche for myself, for my company, just by following these best practices that we know are there, but through our day-to-day work, we tend to just get either sloppy about or let go by the wayside, and things just become more general, more gray.
Yeah.
So that's really what I'm advocating for.
Yeah. And I guess if you don't go deep with your personas, you're almost just relying on firmographic advertising, sort of targeting to reach your customers. And anyone can do that, but no one can easily go deeper with those personas. So it's a good call.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I mean, I think I said it earlier, one of the questions that we use in our persona work is what would make this person feel embarrassed? And I got that question from someone, but it's a really interesting, and of course it's relative to what we're selling. But, one of the worst things any of us can feel at work is embarrassed. When you do something wrong, or when something happens that causes someone to look at you and then you shrink and you have that kind of sick feeling inside of like embarrassment, or I want to say shame. I don't think it's the right word in this context, but I think you know what I mean. That's an emotion that we all so strive to avoid. So if those are the types of things you can focus on, not just what gets you out of bed in the morning or what keeps you up at night, like way too superficial. You really have to be pretty hardcore about how deep you go into the emotions of people, because those are the triggers that are going to help you connect with someone on a whole different level than most others will.
True. So in your view then, who's getting their messaging right? Can you think of any brands that should be getting, say, more recognition for what they're doing than they currently are?
Yeah, I think there are some brands that are doing a great job. I mean, of course, I could cite the big ones that everybody knows and that have, multi-million, hundreds of $1 million budgets, like the Nikes and Apples of the world. But I think it's even more important to look at some of the smaller players who are doing some really interesting niche work. One example in the US that people will know is a company called Zoomcare. And it's on-demand medical services where you can just kind of pop in to see a doctor on demand, or you can make an appointment through the app for same day. As opposed to having to make an appointment with your general practitioner for weeks out, or go to the emergency room or urgent care. But they happen to have particular messaging and branding that speaks directly to what are all of the factors of my life that will make my life so much better because they exist. And that's why it really speaks to me. They're not just telling me about how I can see a doctor with a couple of hours notice. They're talking to me about my day, perhaps as a busy parent, and what I'm going through with my kids, and that I don't have the time to wait, or I don't have the luxury of planning ahead. And all of their messaging is geared around that, where they're basically painting a picture of my life that makes me say, like I said before, wow, they really get me. Well, they get me because they've studied people like me, and they're speaking to me the way I need to be spoken to. So I think they do a masterful job. There's another brand, we have it in the US, you have to tell me if you have it there. It's a beverage brand called Liquid Death. At first glance, you think it's an energy drink, but it's actually just water.
Okay.
And if you look it up online, you'll see all of their branding is around skulls and things like that. But their motto is murder your thirst, which is where they get to Liquid Death. And it's just water. It's regular still water, sparkling water, etc. But the real reason they exist is they want to combat single-use plastics in the water industry. So everything they do is in aluminum, which is much more recyclable. And I'm sure there are other benefits. I don't want to misspeak, but instead of using that as the reason, because it's very hard to get people to care day to day when they just want to reach for something in the fridge at a convenience store about single-use plastics. So they're using branding and messaging that taps into something that I'm going to be able to instantly connect to. But their underlying mission is, if they can get me drinking out of their can and someone else's instead of someone else's bottle, mission accomplished. And I think that's just fascinating. So to me, they're doing a brilliant job. And finally, in the B2B space, there's a company called Gong, G-O-N-G. You may know them. Gong.io is their website, and it's a sales enablement platform to support sales teams within large organizations. But the way they go about crafting their messaging and speaking to salespeople and decision makers within companies is just much more human and relatable. Again, making me feel like they get me as a person, not just as a salesperson. So I'd encourage, if anyone's curious, to just go to any of those three companies' websites and look at what they're doing. And I think you'll be able to pretty instantly grasp why it feels different.
Very cool. Excuse me. So been a great discussion. If I can quickly recap what we've talked about, is just how effective messaging, which brings about desired outcomes, follows that storytelling framework, that anyone can learn and deploy. You described, David, how this is achieved by it covering off the four key things. So personas, ensuring that we go deep with personas to get into those emotional triggers and not just the superficial that anyone can do at a really basic level. Really drilling into cognitive bias as well, understanding those. You mentioned that there are tens of, not quite hundreds, but a lot, but focusing on the 10 to 15 can be really important. Whether or not you eliminate them or lean into them can depend on which route that you take. That storytelling framework respect is also really key and crucial as well. And then there were the five, there was the five parts in that too. And then finally, testing and refinement, and testing and refinement and testing and refinement as well. So we also discussed that when brands get this right, the barriers of purchasing are eliminated or minimized at least as well, because customers are drawn to brands that are connected with their needs and wants. And then you gave us a few examples of brands that are getting messaging right. And at the smaller scale of businesses anyway, so the Zoomcare, Liquid Death, and Gong, some good North Stars to have in our sky. So I think that covers it. David, anything you wanted to add before we wrap?
No, that covers it very well. I appreciate the opportunity to share this. I guess I'll really just add that I'm always available to help and bounce around ideas. Don't necessarily have to work together. I think we're all in this industry to be supportive and help each other out. So anyone who wants to reach out, LinkedIn is probably the easiest way, through a DM or connecting. I'm pretty active there, but always happy to have a chat and help and bounce around ideas.
Yeah, cool. And that's David Paull with a double L as well, if you're interested.
David Paull, 2 L's, and I should come right up with maybe 2 or 3 of us out there, but I'll pop up toward the top. Yeah.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the episode, David, and really appreciate what you and the team are doing at Dialsmith. So keep it up.
Yeah, thank you really very much. I know you have a lot of options for guests, and I'm gratified you wanted to have me on, so thank you.
You're welcome. And for the listeners out there, we'd really appreciate if you subscribe to the podcast, shared it with others, or left a review, and feel free to check out David at Dialsmith as well. So thanks for listening to Now That's Significant.